What's up, guys? With movies like Last Night in Soho and Malignant and countless others, I just have to marvel at the influence that Italian horror's had on horror films over the last few years. It's awesome as a fan of Italian horror. So Last Night in Soho is finally out. I went and seen it last night and can't wait to talk about it. So anyway, let's discuss. Last Night in Soho stars Thomasin McKenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy, Matt Smith, Diana Rigg, and is directed by Edgar Wright. What's up, guys? Welcome to another brand new 2021 horror review. One of my most anticipated movies this year is Last Night in Soho for a couple reasons. One, it really feels like an homage to Italian horror, at least from the trailer that I saw. And also, the great Edgar Wright directs it. Edgar Wright, one of my favorite directors working today. You know, he's one of like maybe 5 directors working today that I will go to the movie sight unseen. And this film, Last Night in Soho, I know that Edgar Wright was influenced by Italian horror, but he was also influenced by 60s films like Repulsion from Roman Polanski. And this movie, part of it, I guess half of it, is set in the 60s. We'll get into the story here in just a second, but I'm glad the movie's finally out. This is how you do a trailer, because the trailer really gave nothing away.
Last night, I saw something in my dreams. There was a girl.
Jack, I don't want to do this.
You think you can just walk away?
It really happened.
But you know, it was just full of those like Edgar Wright-isms, I guess you could call them. And he's just a director that is so fun to watch, you know, really, truly a master behind the camera. And of course, this will be a non-spoiler review because this is the type of movie that definitely goes into some crazy territory in the last act. Of course, there's a big reveal. Our main character of this movie is Eloise, played by Thomasin McKenzie. She looks familiar. I haven't seen her in anything, but man, does she stand out. I think one great thing that Edgar Wright does is he knows how to play on the strengths of his actors. And part of that is just his scripts. His stories are so rich and they're really character centered. You know, thinking back to movies like Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, those movies are great, not only because of the direction, but also of the characters. You know, they're just so likable. This is no exception. And right away, our main character, you fall in love with this character because she is just so innocent, naive, and she's from, you know, the country, but she's like obsessed with, you know, 60s music, 60s movies, and this is set in the present day. And she ends up going to London for this fashion school, and she's thrust into this whole nother world where she, you know, she has to like get with the modern times. She's having a really tough time fitting in, so automatically that's relatable to a lot of people too. But there's a reason why she's so obsessed with 60s culture, because there are some like connections to her family with this 60s culture, and also it ties into the big twist at the end of the movie. But anyway, once she gets to the school in London, again, she's having trouble fitting in with the students there. One of them is very passive aggressive, constantly has to, you know, poke at her with these comments that just dig in, but in a very passive way, which usually, in my opinion, are like the worst insults, you know, because they dig into your subconscious a little bit and you start questioning your own self. And yeah, so these are characters that they're not caricatures. You can relate to them, but they're believable because we've seen people that are very passive aggressive. So she leaves, you know, her dorm and she ends up going to live in this house. And the landlady there is the late Diana Rigg. You might know her from Game of Thrones. I'll have to do some research. I don't know if she actually finished this movie before she passed away. I'm guessing she did, because looking at the movie, I didn't notice any moments where it felt like they were having a stand-in or they had to rewrite anything. I could be wrong, but yeah, sad to see her go. But she was fantastic in this, and she's a key character as well. She definitely plays the same type of character that she does in Game of Thrones, just very cold and, you know, just very forward and upfront, and you can't help but like characters like that. But anyway, This is the point in the movie where reality and fantasy start kind of bleeding into each other. In this room, there's definitely some kind of aura there, and she has these dreams, and then all of a sudden, she enters this 60s world, and this character, Sandy, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, kind of acts as her ego. You know, the id and the ego. This is the ego side of her. And she gets to live through this character that's very bold, confident, you know, pretty much the opposite of who Eloise is. So really, this is kind of like the proverbial rabbit hole of the movie. She goes down this rabbit hole of the 60s, and she's, you know, at first everything seems very beautiful and perfect. But then as she goes down this rabbit hole, she starts seeing these events that might be real, might not. That's where we go into spoiler territory. But then the story starts getting a lot more bold and interesting, and you're left wondering what's going on. Like, there's moments in this movie you're like, are we going to get like a definitive ending to this movie? Or is it going to be just very ambiguous, which is fine. I actually tend to like ambiguity in movies if there's enough of a story, enough of a backbone to back it up. I'm not going to tell you if this movie ends up one way or the other, but what I will say is I was very, very, very satisfied. First off, Edgar Wright. To me, I mean, an Edgar Wright movie is an experience, you know? But he's also very cognizant of the actual story. He definitely wants to give you a story that is satisfying. But he's able to direct his films in such a way that it just really keeps you in focus of everything that's going on. And he's the one director, I think, where the camera and the camera movements are always like 1-2 steps ahead of the viewer. You're always like dazzled and surprised and inspired by his direction and his creativity. He's just a wonderful director that knows how to use the camera, knows how to do transitions within the camera. Like, I think he's a master of transitions, and this is stuff that a lot of people don't pay attention to when they're watching his movies because they're just sitting back and they're just enjoying it. But if you really get down into the minutia of the way he directs films, it's like a master class. It really is. And this is what separates the men from the boys. You know, Edgar Wright does things in the camera that most directors can't achieve. That's a hard thing to do, and also still keep your audience completely invested in what's going on. You know, he keeps the story moving forward. And there's a lot of like effects shots in this movie that are definitely going to remind you of like Italian horror. If you've never seen Italian horror films, after seeing this and *Malignant*, you should definitely want to check out Italian horror films, because these directors, you know, top directors working today like James Wan and Edgar Wright, you can tell that they're highly influenced by Italian film directors. As a matter of fact, even the plot of this movie reminds me of Suspiria a little bit. You know, this fish out of water moving into this big, in Suspiria's case, like this dance studio. In this case, like a fashion studio, but they're in a big city. And so it's like an Alice in Wonderland type story, you know, fish out of water, and how do they deal with these situations. I touched on Thomasin McKenzie, and she really surprised me just how she was able to tap into vulnerability, and just a character that's like hypersensitive and hyper innocent, really the antithesis of who Anya Taylor-Joy is. Anya Taylor-Joy is probably one of the best actresses, young actresses working today. And I was a little worried for Thomasin McKenzie, because how do you stand up toe-to-toe with Anya Taylor-Joy? And I think she kind of steals the show. I don't want to say she's better than Anya, but they both serve their purpose like wonderfully. And you really can't have one without the other. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this is perfect casting on both parts. And there's also like a rhythm to Edgar Wright's movies, you know, and that falls into the character department. There's like a cadence to the way they deliver their lines. Everything is, you know, orchestrated and planned out beautifully. And getting into like the violence, because a lot of you are wondering, is this a horror movie? I would say it's more of a thriller than a horror movie, and I would say the story takes, you know, precedence, takes front and center over whether it's a horror movie or not, because this movie takes a lot of time getting to know the characters and building the story. It doesn't depend on the horror aspects. Now, having said that, there are some pretty great scenes in the last act that are horrific. There's definitely some heavy violence in this movie. You're gonna see some blood in this movie, but this movie doesn't depend on those elements. But when they are presented, they have a lot more impact because of the building of the story and the characters. Now, as far as any cons, I would say some people might, don't go see this movie if you're tired, okay? Because it is long. Some might feel that you could tighten it up a bit. Personally, me, no. This is probably one of my favorite Edgar Wright movies at this point. It's that effective of a movie. Loved the story, loved the performances. Beautifully shot. So I can't recommend it enough. Trapped on an Island. And I kind of expected that, with a director like Edgar Wright behind the camera. Yeah, this is masterclass in horror. This is like A-level, almost highbrow. No, not almost. It is like highbrow cinema. So anyway, guys, have you seen Last Night in Soho? Let me know in the comments. Looking forward to hearing them. Also, be sure to come over to Killer Flicks, where we talk horror all day and every day. And on Fridays, we do Free for Fridays. Follow my Drumdums on my socials. Support me on Patreon. Buy me a coffee. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and Drumdum out.